So we're starting a new series called Be Here Now. And it really is because at Christmas time we have the name Emmanuel, God with us. And so my question is, what does that mean for us? What is it like for the world to have God with us? How do we live that out? And what is it all about? What does it mean to talk about God being here? What does it mean for us to have God here? What does it mean to be fully present in our situation and circumstance in the world? Because that's what the incarnation is about. It's about God leaving the splendor of heaven and coming into the world, being present with human beings in the world. But we understand that we live in a culture in which it's very difficult to be fully present, fully committed to the circumstance. There are so many distractions. It's easy to be physically present somewhere, but actually not to be fully engaged in what's happening and in that place. We have lots of wonderful gadgets to help us to communicate much more easily. I don't know what we did before mobile phones. Sometimes I think it would be quite nice to go back there. However, it's too late for that. But we have all these things that help us to communicate really easily. And we have all these social media. It's great. All these sites you can log into. You can find out what's happening in the world. You can tell everybody in a few characters what you're doing for the day. It's just amazing. And of course, everybody wants to know what I'm doing every minute of every day. It's fantastic that we can do all of that stuff. But actually what happens is it begins to demand more and more of our time and attention. And I don't know if you've ever been in this situation. You may have seen people sitting in a restaurant. You might even have been that person sitting in the restaurant, the lovely wee romantic meal, and you're both on the phone. Somebody was saying this week they had been in a restaurant and they had a big sign up that says, "No, we don't have Wi-Fi. Talk to each other." But that's kind of, that you see it all the time, and you see it more and more. You see, when we were traveling in the summer, you'd be in the airport, and you see people pushing tiny babies in buggies with the iPad. Right? The child's playing games, and you think, goodness sake, they look about 2.5, and they're running, brilliant, do it better than I can. But what are we teaching them? Well, obviously you have to learn, and there are good things to it, and there are benefits to it, I'm not suggesting that, but you have to be really careful how you deal with it. And so it is possible for us to be physically present, but actually be somewhere totally different altogether. And so over the next few weeks, I want to think about that. What does it mean to be here, really be here in the world, and doing what God wants us to do? And today I want to focus on the whole idea of how do you do that when you are totally overwhelmed, when there are just so many things to do and to be done. And at Christmas time, it's easy to feel overwhelmed with everything that's going on, because in addition to all of the normal work that there is to do, you've got all the pressures that go along with Christmas. You've got the shopping. You've got to get the right present for the right person at the right price. So you might see it somewhere, but you've got to go online to check that you can't get it cheaper somewhere else, and then are they going to be able to deliver it in time? And blah, blah, you got all of that stuff that's going on. What about the food? What are we going to eat? When are we going to eat it? How are we going to cook it? Have we got enough cups? Have we got enough plates? You've got all of that. All this stuff that comes with Christmas. On top of all of the things that you're doing anyway. And you may already have too much work. You may already be doing so many things that you don't know whether you're coming or going. You might have taken on responsibility for things, and you simply cannot take on anything else. I don't think they could get another thing on that. I don't even know, is it a buggy that's being pushed by that guy on the bike? But there's certainly far too much on it. For some people, the pressure of Christmas is simply the last straw. They've been coping with so much, and it just becomes too much. On top of that, we have a 24-hour news cycle that gets pictures and news into our houses, on our phones, on our tablets, and our newspaper, on the TV. There's really very few ways to escape from it all. And it brings in things that actually make us feel guilty. They add to the pressures. Now, it's not that these things weren't happening 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. But now, almost as soon as it happens, you know about it. And we see really mainly the bad things. We see the violence and suffering, injustice, poverty, sex trafficking, abusive regimes in the world, and somehow it affects us. We feel that we should do something about it. Well, actually, that's one of the ways that people respond to it all. One of the ways is that we try and put on this superhero image. And we set out to try to do everything we can for everybody that we meet who is in need. And we take on everybody's burdens and responsibilities, and we can do it because we're superhuman. Actually, what usually happens in those circumstances is you find that you try to do everything you can for everybody who's in need, and you end up being burnt out yourself. Or you end up in the situation where what you think is helpful actually is not what they need at all, and you're causing hurt and harm while you're trying to be helpful. Stephen Corbett wrote a book called When Helping Hurts, and he talks about that in this book. He talks about how sometimes in our attempts to do something good for someone, the way that we do it, or the process that we go through, or the exhaustion that we are suffering while we're doing it, actually results in us hurting the people that we're trying to help. The other way that people respond to all the pressures that go on at this time of the year is simply to shut down. They simply say, can't do it, can't do anything, so I'm just not going to. They don't think that anything they do would be helpful or worthwhile. They look at the problem and all they see is the problem. They see the bigness of the problem. And so they think, nothing I can do, so I won't do anything. And they pretend that nothing is happening. But if we are a follower of Jesus, neither of those responses is appropriate. One leads to exhaustion and sometimes people getting hurt. The other leads to indifference and passivity. And neither of those are good options for people who follow Jesus. So how do we stay fully engaged, fully present in a world in which there are so many needs? Well, the Apostle Paul gives us some guidance in the letter that he wrote to the Christians in Galatia. In Galatians chapter 6 we read today, he talks about a number of issues and ways of dealing with this, but one of those is how Christians respond to the social needs of the day. In Galatians 6 and 9 he says, "Let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." First, Paul says, don't become weary in doing good morally or ethically or spiritually. Do good. Don't become weary as you do these things. Paul understood that it's easy to become overwhelmed just with all of the need that there is, particularly when you are trying to be fully present in somebody's life or somebody's situation. It's difficult, and we can be overwhelmed. But he doesn't say, just give up. You can't do it, so don't do it. He doesn't say, well, you have done your best, so you can have a rest now. What he says is, don't disengage. Don't isolate yourself. Don't stop being fully present. Good things will happen to you. Good things will happen around you in the lives of others if you stay engaged and fully present where you are. You will reap a harvest if you don't give up. Then Paul writes, therefore. And in the New Testament, when Paul writes, therefore, you kind of know that something important is coming. He gives the kind of practical bit, and then he says, this is what you really need to think about. And his therefore is Paul's cue to let us know that we really need to tune in on what's coming next. He's about to tell us how we can do this, how we can do this really challenging thing. He's about to tell us how we can avoid becoming weary in doing good. And what he says is this: as we have opportunity. As we have opportunity. That word for opportunity is sometimes translated as time. As we have time. That's the important. Sometimes that's the bit that we forget, though. Paul is acknowledging something really important. He's acknowledging that our time is finite. Some of us need to learn that. We think there are more than 24 hours in a day and we can just keep doing and taking on, and you can't. It's simply not possible. We don't have unlimited time. It is limited. Our opportunities are limited, and our resources are limited. But what we can't do is become so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem in the world that we miss the opportunity to do something for someone, even with our limitations of time. Early on in the chapter that we read in chapter 2, Paul tells the Christians there to carry each other's burden. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So how do we do that? How do we as followers of Jesus embrace our responsibility to carry one another's burden, but at the same time embrace the fact that our time is limited and that we cannot do everything for everyone? Well, I think the answer in some ways is very easy, and in some ways is incredibly complex and difficult. Because the answer is that we're supposed to do what Jesus did. When you read the stories about Jesus in the Gospels and think about how he did his ministry, the thing that you would notice is that he focused on the one. Of course, he was surrounded by crowds. He was often surrounded by lots of people. But in the midst of all of the crowd, very often you read the story, and what he does is he focuses on an individual. He deals with their issue and their concern and their problem. How many people were healed the day Bartimaeus shouted, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me"? There were lots of people sitting around the pool waiting to be healed. But only one was. Jesus focused on the one. If anyone had unlimited resources, it was Jesus. But even he, as he lived his life and did his ministry, focused on the one. I'm sure he could have walked through the crowd and spread his arm to the right and said, "Be healed." And spread his arm to the left and said, "Be healed," and healed them all. But that's not what he did. He focused on the one. I think that's something really important that we need to learn this Christmas and Advent season. Christian minister and author Andy Stanley, in writing about this issue, says this: "Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone." Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. Now, for many of us, that idea flies in the face of everything that we've been taught. I don't know if maybe you think back to school and you said to your teacher, "Can I do this thing?" And the teacher said to you, "Oh, no. Because if I let you do it, I'll need to let everybody do it." And maybe like me, you would say, "But that's okay. You don't really. If you let me do it, I won't tell anybody, and you won't tell anybody, so we're fine. It'll be okay." But no, if I let you do it, I need to let everybody do it. And I know, those of you who are teachers, that there's a need to maintain discipline, and sometimes you just can't do that. I do understand that. But if you grow up with that understanding, if you grow up with that mentality, if I let you do it, I need to let everybody do it, then that raises a huge problem and a huge issue for us. Because you can't do for everyone what you want to do for everyone. You can't do that. It's not possible. We don't have the time, the resources, or the opportunity. And so therefore we need to make decisions about how we respond to the needs of others so that our help for them is appropriate and we don't burn ourselves out. Because if you grow up believing that if you do it for one, you have to do it for everyone, the likelihood is you end up doing nothing for anyone. Let's suppose you needed a kidney transplant and I was a match for you. Well, I can choose to give you my kidney. I've got two. I only need one. That would be great. But then if somebody else came along and I was a match for them, well, they're stuffed because they're not getting my last kidney. I've only got one that I can give away. My resources are limited. But we understand that people all over this country and all over the world die every year because they can't get a kidney. I can only do for one what I might want to do for everyone. We understand that in terms of physical things like kidneys. But sometimes we forget it when it comes to things like time. You only have a limited amount of time. And actually, you can't meet all the needs that even your closest friends have, let alone the needs that the community of Prestwick and Troon and Ayr has, let alone the needs that there are in Scotland, let alone the needs that there are in the world. But you can do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. And there are a couple of things that happen if you decide to live your life that way. It allows you to pursue deep commitments with a few people. rather than shallow commitments with lots of people. Our vision for this congregation says this, that our congregation exists to build a faith-based church that is relevant to everyday life, that enables and releases ordinary people to live extraordinary lives. We can come here Sunday by Sunday and I can tell you things. Hopefully some of it's relevant and some of it's interesting. Hopefully some of it's challenging and stimulates you. But you know what? If that's all it is, you're wasting your time and so am I. Because the thing about faith is that it only works when you do it. It's only relevant when you do it. You can come and sit here like cabbages, but if you don't actually go and do it, well, you're just a cabbage. I don't mean to be rude, but do you know what I mean? Come and listen and learn and grow. But it only actually works when you take the step that says, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to go and do this and I'm going to put it into practice. Because I don't want to live an ordinary life. I'm sorry, that's ordinary. Now, the reality is, quite often, much of my life is ordinary. But I want much more out of life than that. I want my life to have made a difference. I want to be extraordinary. And that comes through faith in Christ. It comes through putting that faith into practice and finding His will for me and going and doing it. That's what makes it extraordinary. And that's what will make it extraordinary for you as well. Here's what happens if we decide to live our lives in this, with this decision that we would do for one what we wish we could do for everyone. Lives will get changed. It makes a difference. Why? Because we move past being passionate about generalizations, about, the homeless or the sick or the poor. And we become passionate about specific people with specific needs and specific opportunities. It changes, for example, our general interest in working with teenagers and the problems that they face, to saying, I am going to invest myself in one teenager or one small group of teenagers. I'm going to give them the best that I have. I'm going to pour time into them and see them grow and see their life transformed. I'm going to help them with all that I have and see the difference that it makes, because I can do for one or two teenagers what I wish I could do for them all. And it moves us into action. The second thing that happens when we decide to do this is that we stay committed for long enough to make a difference. So often we see schemes that start and they last for a bit and they disappear. And you don't really notice any difference at the end of the day. But what we want to do is make a difference, and that means that we have to stay for the long term. Things that are worthwhile demand a commitment. Learning to play a musical instrument well. Well, you don't do it in an hour. You probably don't even do it in a lifetime. People are always learning new things, but it takes time to work. Short-term diets, well, you might lose a lot of weight in a short time, but actually what makes a difference in terms of weight is long-term commitment to lifestyle changes. Jeff Foxworthy, the comedian and writer, tells a story. A time he was asked to go and lead a Bible study at a homeless shelter. And he didn't really want to go. He didn't think it was his thing. But he went, and what he found was people whose lives were a complete disaster. They were a complete mess. Sometimes because of the decisions they had made, sometimes through no fault of their own, they had found themselves there. Addicted to alcohol and drugs, living in squalor quite often, nowhere to go. That the decisions they had made meant that they had no connection, no relations with their family, their friends had given up on them, and they were just the lowest place they could be. And after that first night, he decided that he was going to commit to be at that shelter to help. And he met a man there who was alone because of the choices he had made and the habits he had. And so Jeff decided that he was going to be the one that he would build relationship and friendship with. And it was really difficult. But he simply kept going back and back and back. And he says, there was never a moment when something magic happened, that there was this great thing that you could point to. It was a long, slow process. Week after week, month after month, year after year, he simply went back and spent time with this man. A man who now has come to faith, who is no longer addicted, who has reconnected with his family, who has found new friends, who is now employed in that same shelter, so that he can do to other people what was done to him. Because somebody focused on the one. But you see what happened as a result of that? It wasn't just his life that was changed. His family got him back. The people at the shelter now have somebody who really understands what it's like to be there and be one of them. Other lives are changed as a result. And so this Christmas time, don't try to do everything for everybody, because you don't have the time or the resources or the opportunities. You will simply become weary in doing good, and you'll not be fully present. My prayer is that God will show you the one single parent who's really struggling, the teen who has nobody to talk to, the older person who can't leave home, the neighbour, friend or co-worker who's had a frightening diagnosis, whoever it is, that God will show you the one, or maybe the one group just of 2 or 3 people that you can put time and effort and energy into to see God come to that situation and that circumstance and make a difference. And so my prayer for you is that you will find over this time that one that God has for you to commit to. Because as you do that, your life will be transformed. And over time, their life will be transformed. The people around us will see the change. And it gives us opportunity to speak into their circumstance and their situation, to say, this is what God does. This is what God can do for them and for you and for me. If everybody here decided to focus on one, imagine the transformation that could take place. in the world. You see, we focus on the big, when actually we need to start with the one. But when we do that, the big becomes this great thing that you could point to. It was a long, slow process. Week after week, month after month, year after year, he simply went back and spent time with this man. A man who now has come to faith, who is no longer addicted, who has reconnected with his family, who has found new friends, who is now employed in that same shelter, so that he can do to other people what was done to him. Because somebody focused on the one. But you see what happened as a result of that? It wasn't just his life that was changed. His family got him back. The people at the shelter now have somebody who understands, really understands what it's like to be there and be one of them. Other lives are changed as a result. And so this Christmas time, don't try to do everything for everybody. Because you don't have the time or the resources or the opportunities. You will simply become weary in doing good. And you'll not be fully present. My prayer is that God will show you the one single parent who's really struggling, the teen who has nobody to talk to, the older person who can't leave home, the neighbour, friend or co-worker who's had a frightening diagnosis, whoever it is, that God will show you the one, or maybe the one group just of 2 or 3 people that you can put time and effort and energy into to see God come to that situation and that circumstance and make a difference. And so my prayer for you is that you will find over this time that one that God has for you to commit to. Because as you do that, your life will be transformed. And over time, their life will be transformed. The people around us will see the change. And it gives us opportunity to speak into their circumstance and their situation to say, this is what God does. This is what God can do for them and for you and for me. If everybody here decided to focus on one, imagine the transformation that could take place in the world. You see, we focus on the big, when actually we need to start with the one. But when we do that, the big becomes smaller because change happens. So this year, do for one what you wish you could do for everyone.